and the LCFS. People in the last session talked a little bit about that, and we'll continue that conversation. My name is Joel Levin. I am the Executive Director of Plug-in America. We're a national association of drivers of electric vehicles, and we're the national consumer voice for electric cars. I know a number of people in this room. I worked at the Climate Action Reserve for many years, and I've been at this conference more times than I care to count, but so it's kind of fun to be back here. I want to introduce our two panelists. We have Assemblymember Phil Ting from San Francisco, who's really has stepped forward and is really one of the leaders in the legislature advancing carbon policy. And he's going to talk a little bit about what he's working on and kind of the vision for California. And also we have David Sawaya from PG&E, and you'll hear from him about the role that electric utilities are playing. Electric utilities are really a critical part of the whole equation with EVs, and find out about some of the things that PG&E is working on. So at Plug-in America, we have this philosophy that electric vehicles really kind of sell themselves if you let them. That once people have a chance to experience the cars directly and spend a few minutes behind the wheel, they really get it, like right away. They understand why people love electric cars. So I was hoping that I could bring a couple of, hot new electric cars to the session and park them downstairs and get people to test drive them a little bit before we got started, but it kind of didn't work out logistically to be able to do that. So alternatively, I've got a video that I wanted to show you that hopefully, since it's after lunch, people are getting a little bit dozy. This will kind of get you in the mood for this.
Mode. Whoa! And that's 60. So you don't expect it, right? Isn't that neat?
That's awesome. I'm really mad that the option is insane. Like, it's not like just.
Boy, that's perfect. Isn't that good?
That's a random, like, what's the feature?
Because the car is insane, right? Everyone thinks the car is insane, so why not have, like an insane mode, right?
That makes sense.
So you just come to like a complete stop.
All right.
And then before you know it, you just jam on
it. Brooks, what the fuck?
That's 70 miles an hour.
Brooks, first of all, you can't do that to people. Like, you gotta give people fair warning.
Why?
Like, you can't just say,
yeah, you can.
Brooks,
what?
I think I shit in your seat.
Exactly.
So you're going to go insane?
Yeah, go ahead and press the insane button.
I'm not going to throw up.
I hope not.
Okay, that's enough. Okay, I got it. Holy shit. Oh,
you okay?
That's not funny.
You okay? Does it feel like a roller coaster?
Oh man, it did.
Yeah. Isn't that weird?
But there's no build-up.
No.
It just
goes.
Holy shit. When do you do that?
All the time.
No, you don't.
Yeah, I do.
No, you don't drive like that.
No, not all the time.
Oh my God. I thought it was gonna, what's the word, gradual.
Take off? Are you okay?
I think so.
Okay, so start. So I'll come to a complete stop. So totally quiet. And then that's the insane button right there. And then
oh my God! Oh my God, Brooks! Oh my God!
70 miles an hour.
No way! No way!
Isn't that crazy?
Oh my God!
Basically, right there, that's the sport and insane mode, right?
How do you got an insane on the car?
Isn't that crazy? Who puts an insane mode on the car? So basically, you press that button.
So you ain't got to worry about you staging is simple because
no, you just
ain't
stage
gonna roll.
and you go.
God damn it! That
accelerates
65 miles an hour. Right there.
This is faster than the McLaren on the start, ain't it, guy?
Oh, yeah. I mean, takes you by surprise, right?
Boy, that.
You ready?
Ready?
Sure. Okay. I'm just gonna go when it turns green.
Okay.
Another Tesla. You see it?
That is awesome.
So that was 65 miles.
I can do that every day. I need this every day, Brooks. Every single day.
Okay, thanks. So that's what we're talking about. So at Plug-in America, we believe that the future of transportation is electric. Electric drive is just a fundamentally better way to move cars around, to move people around. It's a simpler technology, it's more elegant, it's more efficient than an internal combustion engine. It performs better than a gas car, as we just saw here. It's not just Teslas. Obviously, this wasn't a Model S, but I drive a Nissan Leaf, not an expensive car, but it still gives you that kick of maximum torque from a standstill. That's kind of the nature of the technology. So EVs are all kind of like that. EVs are cheaper and more convenient to operate because they don't need gas and they take very little maintenance. So I fuel my car in my driveway with electricity that comes from my solar panels and from my local utility. So rather than buying gasoline that comes from halfway around the world, keeps money in your local economy. So I'm supporting my utility, I'm supporting my local solar installers and electricians. It doesn't have a tailpipe, which if you live in a smoggy place like Los Angeles, like I do, obviously is really important. And of course, it has a much lower carbon footprint than a gas car, and the footprint gets better every year as utilities improve their power mix. So instead of dozens of moving parts in an internal combustion engine, an EV is basically just a battery, electric motor, and wheels. It's a pretty simple technology. And in fact, EVs have been around for more than 100 years. So before Henry Ford developed the Model T, actually the most common technology for cars was the electric motor. But the problem was the battery. So for the last 100 years, batteries have been the limiting kind of factor with EV technology. Batteries historically have been heavy, expensive, not very energy dense, won't take you very far, but that is all changing now really rapidly. Since 2010, which was when the first generation of modern electric cars came out, the price of batteries has dropped about 80% since 2010, the price of lithium-ion batteries. And it is continuing to fall by about 15% a year and appears to be accelerating and getting more dense at the same time. So sometime in the next 5 to 8 years, depending on whose numbers you take, EVs are going to reach price parity with gas cars, and then they're going to drop below gas cars, and they're going to keep dropping. And that's when things really start to get interesting. So reflecting that, there's this generational change that's happening right now with electric vehicles, where we're moving from a generation of cars that mostly got around 100 miles of range to a new generation that are mostly getting 200 to 250 miles of range. And that's going on right now over the next year or two. And there's a bunch of those 200-mile range vehicles that are out right now. So when I say that we think EVs are the future, it's not just us, advocacy group, Plug-in America. General Motors has come out and said that they think the future is all electric. Volvo recently announced that they are going to stop developing new internal combustion engine cars. So starting now, all new models that Volvo comes out with are going to be electric or hybrid. And pretty much over the last year or two, pretty much every major global automaker has announced the billions or sometimes tens of billions of dollars that they're investing into electric models. And there's dozens of cars that are planned to roll out over the next couple of years. And there's already, in California, there's more than 40 different models of EVs that are available now. And in fact, I should have brought them in here, but in the expo area, we have a table, and I have a handout that shows all the different EVs that you can find in California right now. So if you're curious, you can dig that out. So there are also many countries that have announced that they are phasing out gas cars completely, new sales of gas cars. France, United Kingdom, Germany, Norway, Netherlands, India, all have said that by 2040, they would like to end sales of new gas cars. But the real kicker is China. So China is the world's largest auto market already, and they are moving faster than any other country in the world, with probably the exception of Norway, which is obviously a lot smaller, on EVs. They have a target of 10% of new cars sold by 2020 to be EVs. 2020, 2 years from now. And the automakers are scrambling to hit it. It's a challenging goal, but they're working on it. And the key to it is the batteries, is really scaling up the production of lithium-ion batteries and driving down the cost. And of course, that's what Chinese manufacturers are good at. That's what they're good at, is doing things in huge scale, really cheap. And so, in fact, China, by 2020, they're already the largest manufacturer of batteries. They're planning to increase production 600% in the next 2 years. So they have just huge factories, like the Tesla Gigafactory. They've got a bunch of factories that scale that are in construction or in planning right now. So they are moving forward in a very serious way, and that should make American auto manufacturers a little nervous, because I don't think they're planning to only sell all those cars at home in China. So when I've talked in auto manufacturing states and given this same kind of talk to them, I tell them that if we want to be manufacturing cars in the U.S. at all, 10 or 20 years from now, we really need to be double down on electric transit, because that's kind of where we're going. So I want to talk a little bit about the current market for electric cars. So last year in the United States, about 200,000 EVs were sold across the country. About half of those were in California. So California is about half of the national market, and it has been pretty consistently over the last few years. Nationally, EVs are a little bit more than 1% of all cars that are sold. In California, they're about 4.5%. But the really interesting number is not that total number. 1% doesn't sound like very much. What's interesting is the way that it's growing. So it's been pretty much 20 to 30% growth over a period of years. Last year, the EV market grew 27%. Last month, in March, EV sales increased 42% over the previous March, which is one of the probably the highest rates of growth so far, and I think that's because so many new vehicles are coming into the market now. I mean, they're filling in a lot of different market segments where there previously weren't EVs. So I'm sure everyone's heard about the Tesla Model 3. The Mitsubishi Outlander has just come out, so the first kind of SUV. The Honda Clarity, the new Nissan Leaf. So there's a lot of vehicles that are coming out and hitting different segments where there weren't really cars before. And there's a number of others that are planned for later this year as well. So let me turn to carbon markets a little bit. So broadly speaking, it's safe to assume that as EV sales grow, if they're continuing to grow 25, 30%, 35% a year, this is going to have some impacts on carbon markets. Demand for gasoline is likely to shrink. Demand for diesel will probably won't be affected so much in the near term, as trucks are a little bit further off. Those are in development. You've probably heard about the Tesla Semi that they're developing, but those are probably a few years away still. And demand for electricity is likely to increase significantly as well. When a household buys an electric car, it generally doubles their electricity demand. So this is a huge new source of demand for utilities, primarily in dense urban areas. That's where EVs are mostly being sold. It's not affecting rural areas so much just yet. It would be a great homework project for a smart analyst, maybe from our friends at ICF, to go sit down and figure out how is this going to affect the demand for CCAs and CCOs if EVs just keep growing at 25, 30%, if we hit the governor's target for 5 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030. So another piece of this also is the effect on the LCFS market. EVs are already a pretty big source of LCFS credits, and as they grow, I think that source of credits is going to continue to grow as well. I learned from Philip in the last section that it's unlikely to have too much of an impact on the price, but it's a lot of new credits coming into the market, and so for whoever figures out how to capture those credits and bring them into the market, it seems like it's a pretty good business opportunity. So I'm going to stop there and let Assemblymember Ting give some remarks. So thank you, and we'll take some questions at the end.
Great, thanks, Joel. Well, thanks everybody for coming out today. This is a very exciting but at the same time challenging time for EVs. We have never had a stronger market direction here in California, but we find that DC is completely going back to the future and going the opposite direction. So it sets up a very interesting potential showdown to figure out whether DC is going to allow California to go with the rest of the world, or whether they're going to force us to fold in to what's going on in Washington. Obviously, we've sent very, very strong signals. Joel mentioned all the various cars that are coming out, the automakers that have been making major announcements over the last couple of years. I would say in large part that has to do with what's been going on in California. We've been very aggressive pushing our greenhouse gas reduction goals. We've been very aggressive in incentivizing clean cars and electric vehicles here. And because of that, we believe that the market has started to change. I've always believed that as consumers, we've wanted to purchase EVs and clean cars for years. But as Joel had mentioned, the choices were, up to a couple of years ago, fairly limited. I got elected in 2012. My commute to Sacramento is about 90 to 100 miles from my home here in San Francisco. So at the time in 2012, really outside of the Tesla car, the Tesla Model S, there was no car that I could afford or purchase that could make my commute one way to Sacramento. So that's very much changing with the Chevy Bolt, the Tesla Model 3, all the various cars that are coming out now with 200+ mile range. I think that's absolutely critical. The governor has moved the goal for the state from 1.5 million cars in 2025 to 5 million cars by 2030. I believe that is completely achievable if we do a couple things. I think we're going to have to modify our existing incentive program to really ramp up incentives over the next couple years to really move the market. I think at this point, what we're seeing is not a significant amount of movement based on our incentives, but more what I would call pent-up demand. You have a 500,000 person wait list for the Model 3. I think you have people waiting for models that really are better fits for their lifestyle and really what they are looking for. The other piece of it is we passed SB 32. SB 32 set very aggressive greenhouse gas reduction goals. 40% of greenhouse gas emissions in our state, in California, comes from transportation. 80% of that comes from us, you and me. It doesn't come from all the UPS trucks, all the freight cars, all the Safeway semis. It comes from you and me driving every single day. And so if we don't change consumer behavior, what consumers are driving, we're not going to come anywhere close to hitting our greenhouse gas reduction goals. That's a fact. That's pure and simple a fact. So we've already enshrined that into law. We've renewed our cap and trade program into law. In order to achieve those goals, we're going to have to make significant progress on passenger vehicles. I'm very proud to have 4 bills right now that I'm carrying in the legislature. One is a bill left over from last year, which is to modify our clean vehicle rebate program, make it a $3 billion program over the next 12 years. The governor came out with a $2 billion 8-year program, so we're in the process of having discussions about how best to figure out what the right amount of time, what the right amount of money really is. One issue that I think is pretty critical around incentives, again, is to make sure that we are ramping up incentives and then ramping them down. Right now, if you're going to have a $2,500 incentive forever, there's no incentive to buy something now versus tomorrow. If the incentive is the same today as it is tomorrow, why do I care about buying the car now? What's going to move me? So I think we have to really follow more of what happened with our solar initiative, which is we had high incentives and then they slowly went down over time as we hit volume targets. So that's really what I think will be effective. I also have my Clean Cars 2040 bill. So similar to what England, France, Norway, India, a number of countries are looking at is to ban the registration of gas cars after Jan 1, 2040. I thought you would think it sounds like a radical move, except for a lot of the world's already moving this way. So in some ways, we're already following. We're not actually going to lead in this effort. But I think it'd be a huge step in the right direction to really send that market signal. And what we've heard is, everybody sort of panicking and what about this, what about that? Again, this is something that's 22 years in the future. This is not 22 months in the future. This is 22 years in the future. 22 years ago, we barely had the internet. 22 years ago, we didn't have smartphones. 22 years ago, the way we compute, the way we operate was very, very different, how we communicate. I actually think in 22 years, the big question isn't whether we're going to have clean cars. It's actually whether we're going to be driving those cars ourselves or whether we're going to be being driven in them. I think the question is not going to be, how my 7-year-old daughter is going to drive. It's whether she is going to drive, ever. And as I've looked at all the autonomous vehicle technology that's being tested out there, no one's testing autonomous vehicles in a Chevy Silverado. Everybody is testing autonomous vehicle technology using electric vehicles, clean cars. So even if we decide we're not going to move the needle and purchase new clean cars, all the companies that are going to make autonomous vehicles and rideshare services for us in the next 3 to 5 years, and it's coming. I mean, for those of you who are in San Francisco, you know it's coming because you see the cars being tested every single day here in San Francisco with their LiDAR technology, and you can see them all around town. It's not like just one car that you see once in a while. So for us in the state, we are going to very aggressively continue to move forward. I don't think that's going to change with the new governor. I think all the gubernatorial candidates who have the likely chance of winning are going to stay the course. They're going to continue to be fairly aggressively pushing these policies. And I believe that if we continue to stay the course, this will be a major, major shift in our country. The charging infrastructure is coming, and you're going to hear from our next panelist how much charging infrastructure is coming. That is really going to be taken off the table. Currently, most of us who have electric vehicles, like myself, like Joel, we charge at home. So that's a very, very common thing. So the big question is for San Franciscans, where 2/3 of the folks here are tenants, how do we get them to charge when they are renters? So I think that is probably the biggest challenge that we face from a EV standpoint is how we help tenants really get access to charging stations and charging ability. So, just to end very, very quickly, I think California sent very clear market signals. I believe given the makeup of our state and the legislature and who's going to be governor, I don't really anticipate any change between now and the next 8 years. I think you're going to see us continue to be very aggressive on this issue, and we're looking forward to seeing many more clean car models coming out in the next couple of years.
Good, thank you very much. David?
Thank you, and thank you for having me today. PG&E is the electric and gas utility for way we're doing it. We also work with a number of the automakers to provide our customers with rebates. We recently announced a $10,000 rebate on the BMW i3 for our customers. That's on top of federal and state incentives, so that really drops you down. When you add the federal, state, the $10,000 and the LCFS rebate that I was talking about, that's over $20,000 off the purchase price of the vehicle. So that's quite a lot. And we're continuing to work with other OEMs to identify other opportunities to give those reductions to our customers. Two other areas that I want to talk about is access to charging that we've already alluded to, and then the cost of fuel and the utilization of the grid. So at its heart, PG&E is an infrastructure company. That's really what we do. And so we think one of the key roles we have to play here is providing charging infrastructure to our customers and making sure that the market here is conducive to people buying a vehicle and not worrying about where they're going to fuel it. We have currently approved or very close to approval 3 large programs to provide charging infrastructure to Northern California. The first is a $130 million program over 3 years for 7,500 charging stations at multi-unit dwellings and workplaces. And then on last Friday, we received preliminary approval for 2 programs, one for $24 million over 5 years to provide make-ready infrastructure for DC fast charging. And then moving into those bigger classes of vehicles, $207 million over 5 years to provide make-ready infrastructure for all classes of non-light-duty vehicles. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, make-ready means everything up to but not including the charger. So traditionally the utility would go up to the meter, and that's kind of where our distribution grid would end. This allows us to provide funding support for infrastructure that goes beyond the meter but doesn't necessarily include the actual charging station at the end of it. Nonetheless, that buys down the upfront cost of the infrastructure by 70 to 90%, depending on what the type of installation is. So it's really a major way for us to accelerate the transportation market. And then the last thing, because I want to open it up to questions and don't want to take up too much time, but is fuel costs. And the previous panel alluded to this a little bit with the discussion of demand charges and other things. It is true that we have to be competitive with the cost of gasoline and diesel in order for the electric sector to take off. And on the residential side, we're pretty close there. There's a few cases where there's some challenge with the cost of fuel, but on our residential EV rate, people who are charging overnight can get roughly $1.50 a gallon by charging at home. So that's quite competitive in California when you look at gas prices. Somewhere else in the country that might not be quite as attractive, but in California that's saving you quite a lot of money. On the commercial side, when you get into higher charging applications and DC fast charging, what we find is that utilization is really low on a lot of those assets because we have a relatively small number of vehicles that are using those assets. I think roughly 90% of all charging occurs at home. So until we have a market of renters like myself who park on the street who are using public charging, you're going to always have a relatively low utilization on those assets. And so the way our rates are structured at low utilization, we have these things called demand charges, which when you have low utilization, those are averaged over a relatively small number of kilowatt hours, and it pushes the average price up. So what we're considering and will be proposing within this year are new commercial rate structures to reduce the impact of demand charges at lower utilization rates over a long period of time, say 10 or 15 years, in order to let the market grow and raise up utilization to the point where that dynamic of low utilization impacting your average cost doesn't really hold.
So let's open it up to questions. If people want to ask some questions, you can ask it to any one of us or to the whole panel. And if you could identify yourself and your organization when you speak too, would be great. So do we have a microphone for people to use? Oh, okay. Do it. So, in the back.
Hi, David Dunn with Idemitsu Apollo Corp. With regards to like the EV credits for the LCFS program, you know, annually you get probably what 85% of them in a lump sum at the at the end of the year. I'm just curious with the growth being obvious, year over year, has there been any engagement with ARB that you could just baseline it at last year's for the quarterlies, right? Because it's going to come in higher, and then just do an adjustment for the differential between one year to another year, and that would help smooth that distribution of credits, put money back to potentially the ratepayers sooner that are, doing the charging, and maybe, helping to fund some additional charging rollouts by the EDUs.
So that's a great question. We have been looking at a number of different strategies to adjust the way in which we use the revenues from our LCFS program. There's a number of different utilities in the state of California. There's investor-owned utilities and publicly owned utilities, and the requirements on both of those are very different as relates to what they can spend that money on. So we actually have to go and get approval from our Public Utility Commission for whatever process we use to return that revenue. We have looked at a number of strategies to increase the amount of money we can provide back to our customers and to smooth it out. And those discussions are ongoing, so I can't give you an answer as to when or if that might happen. But yes, we have been considering a number of those strategies, and I think over the next couple years, all of the IOUs in California only started these LCFS credit return or revenue return programs in the last year or so, and so we're really just getting them off, or have just gotten them off the ground, and we're recognizing that the first crack at it probably wasn't the optimal way to do it, and so we're definitely looking at coordinating with one another and across the state to see if we can improve the revenue to accelerate adoption further.
Hi, I'm Deep Samra from the city of Pasadena. This question is for Assemblymember Ting. You just mentioned the bill about in 2040 to ban the registration for gas cars. Given that the secondary market right now is very limited for electric vehicles, what are the steps that we need to take to really get us there? And also just how to enhance that secondary market for EVs. Even though we have 22 years, I'm just wondering what can we do to really get there?
Thanks for the question. So my bill, AB 1745, only deals with new cars. So it actually doesn't prohibit anybody from buying a used gas car, even in 2040, and driving that. The only way to have a used car market is to sell more clean new cars. And as Joel had mentioned, we're just getting up to speed with options, and we're just starting to see greater market penetration. But even in California, I think the percentage of clean cars that are being sold relative to gas cars is what, 3% or 1%?
4.5% now with plug-ins and battery electrics, yeah.
So it's still very small, and so we need those cars to be purchased, and then, 5, 6, 7 years later, they become the used car market. But we're still a little ways off on that.
One little tip just to toss in there for those of you that are thinking about buying an EV. Used EVs are really cheap. There's this sort of market disequilibrium where basically most people lease an EV for 3 years, and then once they come off lease, everyone's like scared of them and they think that there's something wrong with them. So there's for the used EVs that are out there in California, they're like cheaper than they should be. So just saying.
Well, and just to give you a sense, right? It's like you could find a 3-year-old Nissan Leaf or a Fiat 500e for $7,000. I mean, so just to give you comparable, for $7,000, that's the price of like a 15-year-old Camry probably. So it gives you a sense of how much older the technology is, how many more miles in the terms of the technology. So Joel's totally right. If you're looking to get a used car and you don't need to drive that many miles per day, a used Leaf or a used Fiat are great options.
Hi, I'm Beng Feng with LADWP. So with the Clean Vehicle Rebate Program, there's income limits to help target rebates for low-income customers. Do you know if there's any legal or equity issues with using low carbon fuel standards credits for that purpose, or for low-income customers?
Sorry, so are you asking if in our programs of returning the LCFS revenue, there's any income limits or anything like that? Is that what you're asking?
Meaning like if LADWP wanted to do it.
Yeah, so I can't answer whether there's a legal issue associated with it. Within our programs currently, we provide that rebate to any one of our customers who has purchased an electric vehicle. They simply have to provide us with the vehicle identification number and registration. So there's no income limits there. I think we have discussed some options for increasing the incentive for lower income customers, or potentially providing an incentive on secondhand EVs for lower income customers through that same program. To be honest, we never got to the question of is there a legal issue associated with it, because I just don't know whether that's the case or not.
I think that for municipal-owned utilities, you have much broader leeway than an investor-owned utility like PG&E does, where everything they do is tightly controlled by the PUC. I think you have pretty broad flexibility as to how you choose to spend that money. So my guess is you could probably do that if you wanted to.
Yeah, that's a great point. So in fact, the publicly owned utilities, much of their LCFS revenues go towards infrastructure programs because they don't have the same funding structure that the IOUs have, where we actually go to a regulator and ask for authority to install to invest in the infrastructure. So many times the POUs will take some portion of those LCFS revenues to install DC fast chargers or level 2 chargers around their area.
More questions?
Hi, Anna Garza Buttes with San Diego Gas and Electric. So David, you mentioned about the particulate matter in heavy-duty semi-trucks. What about electric buses? I know China has been extremely active. I think they're leading the world in the most electric buses. How's that going? Well, I guess this question will be to all of you, but how's that going in our state, and does that help solve the problem that you raised about the particulate matter?
Well, I could talk about roughly how it's going, and then maybe David could talk about the particulate matter part. I just met the CEO of Proterra, which is a company here in Silicon Valley. It was very exciting. What he told me is, of all the bus contracts and bus sales over the last year, his company did 10% of sales across the country. And I think that is just amazing to see that kind of jump so quickly. It also demonstrates, I think, there's a huge amount of demand. I'm actually more optimistic from a fleet standpoint, from a large truck standpoint, that once the technology has been developed, the adoption is much easier. When you have a fleet, you don't have to worry about the charging as much, because once you've decided to go with a certain type of technology, whether it is hydrogen fuel cell, whether it's just electricity charging, you can install those stations, and the fleets move to specific locations. They're not like you and me, where we're just driving all over the place. We have to charge here and charge there. They have a set route, or they're doing certain things, and they're fueling at particular places. So I actually am much more optimistic that we're going to make faster progress once that technology gets developed on the fleet side.
Let me just jump in real quick. So actually with electric buses, there are certain uses for which electric buses actually I've heard pencil out very well today. But particularly, in uses where a bus is doing kind of a short loop, or it's doing the same loop all the time, and you can kind of charge in between its route, and also where they're very intensively used, like a bus that's being driven 12 or 18 hours a day, because buses spend so much money on diesel fuel and on maintenance. So rebuilding the brakes, rebuilding the engines, all those things are really expensive. So the actual cost of operating the vehicles is very high. And with an electric bus, even though it's a little more expensive to buy it up front, if you're using it really intensively like that those cost savings are apparent really quickly on. So there's certain uses for which electric buses actually work really nicely even now.
Yeah, so I actually agree with everything that was said. I think transit, one of the reasons we proposed this program to provide electric infrastructure for non-light duty vehicles is the realization that many of these fleets do circulate and come back to a home base, so they're actually very conducive to electric. What I meant earlier was as you start looking at longer haul applications, that's much more difficult with batteries, because the batteries are so heavy that they start really biting into your cargo capacity. On the bus issue is really interesting. When we put this program forward, and I was starting to look into that market, we actually very quickly identified transit as one of the beachhead sectors, because it's one of the few areas, as was mentioned, that has a very conducive duty cycle to electric. It's also one of the few areas that has manufacturers like Proterra and like BYD who are making purpose-built electric buses. So in many of the other non-light duty sectors, you have upfit vehicles, which are, not to sound too pejorative about it, but they're kind of science experiments, right? You're ripping apart a car or a vehicle, taking the engine out, you're putting batteries in it and replacing the drivetrain, but you're not actually building them off of a manufacturing line. So the scale doesn't get there, and the reliability from a fleet manager perspective isn't really there compared to like a real purpose-built OEM. So I think it's going quite well in California today and across the country for electric buses. In terms of particulate matter and air quality goals, they solve that problem for transit buses, but transit buses are a tiny fraction of the heavy-duty vehicles that are circulating on our roads. There's about 12,000 of them, maybe 14 in the state, and there's about 1 million non-light-duty vehicles. So it's a really, really small amount. On the China point, they're beating our pants off. They're absolutely killing us. When the city of Shenzhen electrified their entire bus fleet of 10,500 vehicles, and we have about 14,000 buses in the entire state of California, and about 100 of them are electric. When they come here, they actually laugh at us. So, I think it just is very important for us to recognize that other people are doing this and moving very quickly, and it's important for us to support the entire ecosystem so that these things move forward.
So my name is Matt Shumway with Chevron. So I guess a couple questions. First, with the Assembly Member Ting, the bill that you're proposing, are you only focused on EVs, or is it any, like is hydrogen included?
It's a zero-emission car, right?
Zero
So that's why it's called Clean Cars 2040.
Gotcha. So I just wonder how you, like I've seen arguments in other jurisdictions about you restricting people's choices, especially the impact that it's going to have on lower income people that aren't able to buy these more expensive vehicles, and potentially the increase of used car, how much the price is going to increase. Just what's your response to that, and thoughts on how this could be addressed?
I think it's a great question. I think it's what the Western States Petroleum Organization has put out as the main counterpoint to my legislation. I think it's very simple. In 2040, we allow everyone to choose any car they want as long as they don't pollute the air that we all breathe. So I think it's very simple. So you can choose any zero-emission car you want. anyone. And we believe that by the time 2040 comes around, you're going to have a number of choices. It's a great question around low-income communities. As you know, most low-income families don't buy new cars, which is why we only talked about new cars. They buy used cars. So we didn't talk about the used car market. We don't put that requirement on the used car market. We believe that at this point we still need to have a more robust used car market. But you're right. I think choice is absolutely paramount, and every Californian gets to choose any new car they want as long as they're not polluting the air I breathe or Joel breathes or David breathes. I think it's a pretty fair argument.
This is Jesse from PG&E. It's my understanding that there is a discussion going on around LCFS to decide whether or not EV chargers get the credits based on the capacity or based on the utilization of the chargers. And I was wondering if any of you have a perspective on which is better and why, especially if it has any ramifications for placement of chargers and how that pertains to drivability and connection of the service.
So we haven't actually been generating very many non-residential LCFS credits for electric vehicles up until now. PG&E hasn't generated any, and even the overall market hasn't generated a lot of them. And the large reason for that is it gets really complicated when you start having to measure every kilowatt hour individually. So when we generate the credits for our residential customers, we take an average based on a set of data across the entire EV market that charges on our grid, and we average that load profile across all of the EVs that charge. And so we are able to, through a very efficient calculation, generate a lot of credits. When you start having to do it at the individual charger level, which you would have to do at commercial chargers because they're not uniform, it starts to get a lot more complicated. Having said that, as the market gets more and more robust and the value of these credits becomes more real to companies, I think you're going to see a lot of third parties coming into the market to aggregate the commercial charging and get those credits into the market. But right now it's a fairly small part of the market anyway, because like I said, it's only about 10% of the charging that occurs.
Hi, this is Faria with PG&E as well, and I promise this wasn't premeditated. I'm not a plan. I'm just enjoying the conversation. And my question is actually for you, Assemblymember Ting. You had talked about how there was a lot of pent-up demand for electric vehicles that hasn't been met yet. And while I think that's certainly true, and especially in places like California, there's also this countervailing argument that there's a lot of demand for big SUVs because gas prices are cheap. And that's one of the main reasons that automakers are pushing back on the federal emission standards. So, until gas prices actually go back up again, like what more can we do to educate people and help, shape, what their preferences are in the direction of cleaner options? And in particular, is there anything we can do to incentivize dealerships to help provide that education and help direct people to look at cars that they might not be aware of or wouldn't otherwise consider, and instead they see all these commercials for, the latest, sexy new SUV that comes out?
I think it's a great question. The clean car market within the automakers and the car dealer market is completely the antithesis of everything they've been doing for over 100 years. It's a huge culture change for everyone. It's a culture change for the automakers. It's a culture change for the car dealers. And any time, if you try to do a culture change in PG&E or any large organization, it's very difficult to shift that. I also don't think you should tell people what you want to buy, and that's what I started with the automakers. It's really not about it's not about telling people they should buy the Nissan Leaf, right? We need to produce cars that fit their lifestyle. That's partly why the bill I talked about is having a 22-year leeway, so you could provide plenty of time for adoption. We should have SUVs that are clean cars. There's no question. Volkswagen announced they're going to bring back their classic 1970s van in a clean car vehicle. It's supposed to have a 300-mile range. I'm picturing people with their surfboards and heading to the beach in this new Volkswagen van. But I don't have any problem with people selling minivans or SUVs. I think that's great. I think the challenge is, from a regulation standpoint, is the emissions. So again, we want people to have clean air. We don't think poor people have less of a right to breathe clean air than rich people, which is currently a fact right now. So we just want to ensure that you have a variety of models that are zero emissions. Going back to your point, going back to my previous point, why do I think there's pent-up demand? I mean, all you have to do is look at the Tesla Model 3 in a 500,000 person wait list. 500,000 people wrote Tesla a $1,000 check for a car they've never driven, never seen, never touched, 500,000 people. If that's not demand, I mean, I don't know what is, right? And I know part of that's Tesla. I know part of that's the video you saw. I know part of that is the mystique in the brand, but what that tells me is 500,000 people are waiting to get into zero-emission cars, period. And they've done so by doing, not just by putting their name and their email on a list, they put down $1,000. So there is a huge amount of demand, but again, you need cars that match people's lifestyles. And right now, we have cars in particular niches, and that's growing. But at this point, you don't have the breadth or the depth of cars that people would like to purchase. And I think once you start seeing more of that, you're going to see adoption really spike.
Yeah, just want to add to that. So one of the challenges, and I talked about this a little bit, but there are big parts. We're sitting in downtown San Francisco right now, but there are big parts of this country where people don't drive cars like at all. They drive trucks and they drive SUVs and they drive kind of more heavy-duty vehicles. They don't. Most EVs right now are subcompact cars. I mean, that's changing. But as I said, if you look at the many different segments in the car market, there's still a lot of them where there is no EV. And those are gradually, bit by bit, being filled out. There's still no pickup truck. That's sort of like the holy grail when someone comes up with a really good electric pickup truck. And, we will eventually. And so we need to do that. And it's not realistic to say to someone who's always driven a pickup truck, oh, you have to drive a Chevy Bolt. They're not going to be doing that. And so we need to respond to the realities of what people drive. And we're getting there. It'll get easier and easier as batteries get denser and smaller and cheaper. But that's why, automakers are starting with small vehicles, because it's easier to do that. And getting to like a pickup truck or like the equivalent of like a Ford Expedition electric is harder, but we're getting there. And it's all about battery technology that's gonna help us. But 22 years is a long time. Certainly well before that, we should have easily the capacity to electrify any vehicle of any size. One more really good question. I think we have a little bit of time left. One challenging, provocative question from somebody. All right, way in the back.
You said challenging, provocative, so I'll try. I'm Jerry Hansen, and I'm CEO of Sustainable Napa County. And one of the things that we're working on is accelerating electric vehicles in our community. But I wanted to talk more about, from your future forecast or a crystal ball, we're talking about cars like we're talking about them in today's view. In 22 years, as you said, Assemblyman, your daughter won't maybe drive, and she may not even need a car at all. And so how are we interfacing? Are we looking ahead to, from a policy perspective, to plan for incentives and programs for things like car sharing for low-income households who may not need a car all the time, could share the cost, someone else could perhaps buy it for them. They could be a multifamily development where they could just sign up for it and use it.
Are there forward-thinking policies or programs that you're looking at already to help make those things possible? Or like the Airbnb of cars where you're on vacation and someone else can use it while you're away. Are we looking at those already, or are we just kind of trying to get our sea legs on this now and address those when we have to jump off that bridge?
I think from a policy perspective, when you're dealing with the innovation economy, you don't want to step in too soon or too late. And I think that's one of the major challenges. We constantly confronted with those issues here locally in San Francisco because we are a city of early adoption, which is great. The challenge with the model that we talked about, or I talked about earlier around autonomous vehicles, we're not exactly sure what that market will look like. Different people, whether it's Uber or Lyft, have talked about their model. It sounds like they may just continue their model where instead of having a driver pick you up, it's just an autonomous vehicle picking you up and you're still charged whatever rate you're charged based on that ride. I don't know what the Waymo model is, whether they're going to do a subscription service or whether they're just going to charge you per ride either. But if we start seeing a movement going toward more of a monthly subscription, which is unlimited, you can go anywhere you want, you don't have a car in your garage, you just call the car and the car comes and gets you and you go to wherever you feel like. I think that's a question whether or not how soon that market comes. So from a policy point of view, I don't think you want to intervene too quickly. I do have legislation around autonomous vehicles, but much of it is really around testing and consumer pedestrian safety to make sure there's safety on the streets. And I'm want to make sure that we don't get too far ahead so that you hurt the innovation, because I think the innovation's pretty remarkable. But having said that, I mean, we all know 98% of the time our vehicle sits parked, not being used. So the question is if vehicles are being used 24/7 or they're being used 22/7, depending on the time that they're charging or doing however long it takes to refuel, how many actual cars do you need on the road versus how many cars do you need parked? I know, say, the building owners here in San Francisco are thinking about it because they see a future very soon where their parking garages and their office buildings won't be used. People are starting to drive less. They're wanting to drive less. They're not commuting into San Francisco with their cars. So I think from a state point of view, I think we want to be very careful to not get too far ahead of it because we don't know what this market will exactly look like in 5 years. But it's going to be fascinating because these cars are going to be on the road in 5 years. I fully believe that.
There are manufacturers who are planning to roll out autonomous rideshare vehicles soon, like in the next 12 months. They'll start to be on the roads. I don't know in California necessarily, but at least in some states, they will start to be on the roads in the next 12 months.
Yeah, and if I can just add, I think a lot of the challenges associated with autonomous vehicles are actually, from a clean vehicle standpoint, are actually very similar to what we see with ride sharing. While the economic implications of the two things are substantially different, I think from just what type of vehicle do you need and what type of infrastructure do you need in order to support that sort of a network, I think they're very comparable. And what we're seeing today is General Motors, their ride sharing or ride leasing service is called Maven, and they have several hundred Chevy Bolts in their fleet, which they lease to Lyft drivers here in San Francisco. And those drivers pay a set fee for full access to the DC fast charging network of EVgo here in San Francisco. And the results have been staggeringly successful. These vehicles are putting several hundred miles on a day in full electric operation. It's increased the utilization of the chargers by 25 to 30% in some cases. And the biggest learning there has been we need more charging infrastructure. And it was the main, they've told us that we would put more vehicles in this fleet in San Francisco if you guys could put in more charging infrastructure. And so that was one of the main drivers behind us proposing this $22 million fast charging program, was really wanting to accelerate the adoption of those vehicles because it makes a lot of sense. They're very high mileage. It's actually very, very comparable to the transit. They're very high mileage vehicles in relatively localized areas. So as long as you have the charging access, they're perfect.
Well, and the last point, which Joel mentioned earlier, is there's almost no maintenance. I mean, what people don't realize is that, yes, the upfront costs are higher, but over the over the life of the car, the costs become much lower because there is no maintenance. So that, I think, is also why you hear all these tech companies and the ride-sharing companies, all of them, they're looking at autonomous vehicles, and they're not testing like 20 different types of autonomous vehicles. They all see this future as clearly electric and zero-emission cars. They've made that very, very clear. You're not going to get picked up in a Hummer and getting driven around town. That's not really what they're looking at. They've made very sure where they believe the future of this technology is going, and that's what they're driving.
Great. Well, on that note, I believe that we are out of time. So thank you all for sticking around and paying attention. And thank you, guys.